This light on. Welcome. Thanks for this is a great audience. A lot of people. Thank you. This week's episode of the Environmental Studies Speaker Series is co-sponsored. This is a first. We're very excited about that. So the libraries have agreed to, or offered, I should say, to provide the snacks today. So hopefully we'll continue with. Thank you. Hopefully we'll continue with such collaborations in the future. So today our guest is Matt Nusstein, environmental educator for New York. I'm going to take my time to read that agency's name carefully. New York State Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, hereafter known as New York State Parks because it's too long. He's based at the Humphrey Nature Center at Letchworth State Park. If you've ever been there, if not, you should. And I think it's been almost 10 years with New York State Parks, right? And Matt has a bachelor's degree in wildlife biology concentration from Buffalo State. And after that, he did a series of internships in environmental education for state parks and for the DEC as well. So I'm going to pass this on to you.
Yes, thank you.
All right.
All right, so thanks for inviting me out today. Again, just briefly, so I work for the state parks as we have different titles. Our official title is environmental educator, but we've also in the past used the title of naturalist, park naturalist. Essentially, my job in the state parks is to take people out in the parks, share with them the resources we have. We also will take data or studies and interpret that data as a way to share it with people as well. So I kind of just view myself as a little bit as an entertainer because we have to keep people's interests. But we also like to do science, and we like to take that science and make it understandable for everybody. And this particular topic is one of my favorite presentations to give. I've called it Our Changing Forests. And one of the reasons I really like it, a lot of times when we're learning, when I was in college, when we're studying things, we're checking out forest ecology, we're learning about different environments and ecosystems. We often focus on other places. We might focus somewhere in the tropics, we'll focus out west. But here in New York, we have incredible ecosystems. We have incredible places to explore. And those places also have their own conservation issues and things that need our attention. So this has kind of been a program I've been doing for almost my whole career with the parks, about 10 years. As a way to just kind of introduce the fact that we have all these incredible places in New York. There are some problems going on that we could help solve. And then to also highlight the fact that humans don't necessarily like change, but change is always going to happen no matter what we do. And our forests are a great example of what that change might look like. So we'll kind of be talking about all those things as we go. I'm going to do my best to not run over time as well. Uh-oh. Let's see. I just tried the arrow. Let's try this. There we go. Didn't click on the presentation. So, again, I talk to thousands of people in a given year. And one of the things, especially at Letchworth or when I was working up at Niagara State Park, when you get people who aren't from New York, and they have this vision of what New York is, they think of New York City. That's what they picture. The entire state is one giant city, but we're not. We all know that. We live here. And as you can see, roughly 63% of the state is forested. That is roughly 18.9 million acres. And today, this will be a topic we talk about in a little bit. We have more forest in our state than we have had in the past 150 years. Out of all the 18.9 million acres, many of it is privately owned, 14.4 million acres. That's 80% of the forested land. Number of tree species, you have over 100 commercial and non-commercial. Honestly, now with all the cultivars and things getting planted, that number is even much higher than 100. And out of our forest types, maple, beech, and birch, that's about 53% of our common forest types. So here's just a nice little satellite image that kind of highlights that 63% of the state being forested. Obviously, the green means green space doesn't necessarily mean they're all trees, but it's agriculture is included in that, and forests. Much of that is centered around the Catskills and the Adirondacks, but also down here in the southern tier. Over towards the west, you can see Allegheny State Park by the Pennsylvania border. But then as you get a little bit north in western New York, that white is showing more human habitation, more development, more cities, and obviously down by New York City as well. So just a fun map to kind of represent visually what that 18.9 million acres might look like. So what is a forest? I will be open to anyone's thoughts. You can raise your hand, shout something out. When I say the word forest, what comes to mind?
Lots of trees.
Lots of trees. What else? You hear forest, something comes to mind. Maybe it's just lots of trees to everyone. Go ahead. Lack of development, good. Bears, wildlife. So what I did is I just pulled some stuff. I Googled that, simple as that. And I pulled some different words right out of Google, some different definitions. The first one being a complex ecosystem consisting mainly of trees that buffer the earth and support a myriad of life forms. Quite the definition. The next one, a large area covered chiefly with trees and undergrowth. You'll see they're getting shorter and shorter. A forest, large area dominated by trees. A thick growth of trees and bushes that cover a large area. I went too far. So basically what this might be getting at is that it's a very big area. And the reason I point this out, and sometimes I use the words interchangeably, but I don't necessarily call what we have in New York, maybe outside of the Adirondacks, forests, especially around this part of the state. I usually use the term woodlot or woods, because much of what we have is actually small fragmented tracts of forested area. When I think of a forest, I'm thinking of something down at like the Smokies. We got thousands of acres that are untouched, that are all connected. And you have all these plants and animals living there. But what we tend to have in Western New York are these little fragmented sections. So sometimes I prefer the word woodlot. That's purely a personal choice, but just something to think about. I should mention, which I usually do in the beginning, I'm not a professional forester. I'm not a biologist. I'm simply a naturalist. And my job is to just make observations and take studies that other people have done and again, interpret that. So much of what I'm saying today isn't based on studies I've done. It's just based on observations I've made doing the job I do. And then also taking a lot of what Cornell foresters have done or the Department of Environmental Conservation, what their foresters have done, and try and interpret that and present it in this. So again, I'm not a professional forester by any means. Why are forests important? Obviously, there's the economic value, recreational, state parks, tourism, the forest industry itself. So this could be including people doing timbering. It can be the recreational aspect, but we employ about 60,000 people, probably over that, and directly contributes about $4.6 billion to the state's economy annually. So there's an economic value to having forests. Then there's the simple intrinsic value, just the fact that we have the forests. Again, recreational. When people are stressed and need a break, they often go to a park or somewhere out in nature to relax. Ecosystem services, things like water filtration, carbon pools, clean air, providing habitat for wildlife, and again, an increase in quality of life. You're feeling stressed, you want to go camping, you relax, get away from the work week, you go out to nature. Forests are dynamic. This is kind of going to be the theme going forward. I'm sure at some point everybody has seen that little forest succession diagram where you start off with the field and then eventually shrubs take over and then animals can move in and they bring in things like acorns and hickory nuts, and then you get a mature forest and eventually that develops into a climax forest. It's a natural cycle. A forest doesn't always look the same, and it shouldn't always look the same. They're always changing. It has many parts: wildlife, plants, invertebrates, the soil. All of the stuff that makes up a forest are all interacting, and that is what a forest is. It's not just trees, but it's the soil, it's the rocks, it's the biotic, abiotic factors all interacting with one another, and it always changes. So the forest has changed. I have a picture of the last ice age, the extent of the Laurentide ice sheet over New York. It was, I think, about 2 million years ago, if I have that date right, of when we first were plunged into an ice age, which then started to finally end at about 12,000 years ago, somewhere around there. When the glacier retreats, it's not like there was a bunch of trees that were under the ice that just sprang up. So we didn't actually have a forest after the ice melted. The ice sheet that was here was projected to be somewhere around 2 miles thick. It's a lot of ice. It did a lot of scraping as it retreated. So after it left, we were a tundra for quite some time. Again, there weren't little trees just suppressed under the ice that flung up. There was nothing. It was rock. It was tundra. So there's the succession. We didn't start with a forest after the ice age. We had a tundra. Eventually, climate changes, trees start to move in, and we kind of looked more like a boreal forest for quite some time. And it really wasn't until about 6,000 to 8,000 years ago that our modern forests that we think of today in the state actually appeared. So if we think about that, that's actually pretty impressive. That wasn't geologically that long ago, 6,000 to 8,000 years. To us, it seems like state probably always looked like this, but it really hasn't. This is kind of a new thing. These are kind of cool little pictures that I like. An artist made a rendering of things that would have lived in the more boreal forest after the tundra phase in the state. We had giant ground sloths here. We had mastodons, stag moose. We had giant beavers. And these things would have been all living right here in Western New York. Kind of cool to think about. So again, forest has changed. So jumping way ahead now to the 1600s, again, modern forests 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. Now we're at the 1600s. The state was almost entirely forested. Red spruce, balsam fir, white pine, dominating conifers that we had, beech, sugar maple, oaks, hickories, chestnuts, you can read the rest, were some of the dominating deciduous trees. Then in the 1700s, we started to see some massive land clearing for farming, European colonization happening around that time. By the 1800s, most of the forests outside of the Adirondacks and some of the Catskills were largely cleared, converted to be farms. So we lost a huge chunk of our forest. Then, jump up to 1900s, farmlands were starting to be abandoned. The big, large-scale farming just wasn't economically feasible for a lot of people, so farms started to be abandoned. When that happens, we start to see succession all over again, and some of those lightweight, early successional tree species started to colonize. Things like you see on the screen up there, the little winged samaras from a maple. The trees and bushes and shrubs that have wind-dispersed seeds are the first to colonize after a disturbance. And it's not till a little bit later on that things like your oaks and your hickories that have a heavier nut then move in. Because an acorn doesn't blow around in the wind, it needs an animal to move it. So as a result of these early successional habitats, white-tailed deer started to increase. Ruffed grouse started to increase because that's their preferred habitat. So here's a nice graph that was thrown together by SUNY ESF, and it kind of shows the changes of millions of acres through time. And you can see how that graph is changing, representing where we had forests, then Europeans arrived. There's that steep drop off as we started to clear cut and clear the land. And then again, by the 1900s, as farms started to get abandoned, the number of forests go back up. Well, I should say the number of trees go back up. As a result of that, many of the woodlots that you walk around in this area are 80 to 100 years old, somewhere around there, because the farm started to grow back up into a forest or woods. So there was a forester survey done by Cornell University that went and looked at some of these regeneration sites, these abandoned farm fields that were growing into woods. To most people, they drive by and they see trees and they think, oh, good, well, that field turned back into a woods. Well, the foresters discovered that the regeneration was marginally successful or a complete failure. And what that actually means is that what has regrown isn't really as healthy as what was there prior to us coming and clear cutting and then a new forest growing. Part of the reason, deer browse. We have a lot of deer. They like to eat plants. We'll talk a lot about deer later on. Interfering vegetation, which can be things like non-native species, are now part of the landscape that weren't there before. And it sounds kind of harsh, but lack of landowner interest or knowledge. Usually, at least when I talk to people, what I find is they just don't know that these plants on their property are non-native, or they don't have the money and time to really care about it. They got farms to run, they got jobs to do. They can't be worrying about all these bushes growing in their woods that are from Japan. So I think that is what the interpretation of that is. So another little map of what our forest habitats look like today. You can see just based on colors, you don't have to necessarily worry about the words too much, but it just shows you that the forest makeup isn't the same throughout the state. There's different types. There's pine barrens, there's deciduous woods, there's conifers. There's a mix of different forest types in the state. Current challenges, and hopefully that plays, there it goes. So we start off with the nice woods, and then somebody builds a house, and then there's a road, and then somebody else builds a house, and another person builds a house, and pretty soon that nice woods you had turns into a suburb. So habitat loss and fragmentation, it's one issue that is present still today. Forest regeneration, because of fragmentation, because of people bringing in non-native species, both invasive plants and animals. And climate change, things are changing, the climate is different. And explosive deer populations. So these are current challenges that our forests are facing right now. Even something as common, especially towards the southern tier, is windmills. Windmills start fragmenting the woods. Again, I specifically mentioned that a forest, in my mind, is a huge, untouched, unbroken tract of woods, of trees. But much of what we have is fragmented little woodlots scattered throughout the state. When you have fragmentation, these become disturbed sites. It paves the way for invasive species to move in. It also starts to concentrate area-dependent species. So things that need that big, untouched tract of land are now in these little islands. And some of those animals are very hesitant to move out of their island. They don't want to cross some of these fragmented areas. You can start getting localized inbreeding because of that. Diseases spread much quicker, starvation. These are all effects of fragmentation. It's not all doom and gloom. There are some things that do quite well when humans move in. Raccoons. You can be in Buffalo or Rochester and have raccoons in your backyard. They are totally fine with it. Opossums, coyotes. Again, you can go into the city and find coyotes, and obviously deer. These are all things that have actually done much better due to our presence in what we have done. Birds as well, blue jays, common grackles, brown-headed cowbird. For those who aren't birders in the group, brown-headed cowbirds are actually, they're native to the United States, but they were mostly restricted to the West. And they have evolved to follow bison herds. And because of that, bison herds, if you know anything about bison, you know that they are nomadic. They roam around. They don't stay in one spot. The birds like to follow them. They're kicking up bugs. The birds are eating the bugs. Well, when you're following a nomadic animal for your lifestyle and you need to nest, it's very hard to commit to a nest for several weeks because then all of a sudden the bison are gone. So brown-headed cowbirds evolved what is called nest parasitism. They will lay their eggs in another bird's nest and then leave their eggs to have that bird take care of it for them. A parent's dream. So they are a parasite of other birds' nests. Not so much of a problem out west because they had co-evolved with those birds for quite a long time, and those birds were able to recognize what a cowbird egg is, maybe what a nest is, and it wasn't too bad. Well, we might be familiar with the fact that we slaughtered most of the bison out west, and we introduced cattle. Cowbird can't tell the difference, it's a big animal. So the cowbird started following cattle around and slowly started to expand east. So they're here now in New York, follow around the cattle. Well, the birds in New York didn't really co-evolve with brown-headed cowbirds, so they have a harder time recognizing when a cowbird egg has been introduced into their nest. So oftentimes they will just raise the cowbird chick. The cowbird chick often develops quicker. It'll bully out the other chick or just totally dominate all the parents' attention, get all the food. So several of our songbirds have actually declined or haven't done as well since cowbirds have arrived to the east. There's a really cool picture though of a yellow warbler nest, which is a small bird in New York. It's a yellow, it's like goldfinch size, a little smaller, where it did recognize a cowbird laid an egg in its nest. So it built a new nest, and then the cowbird laid an egg in that nest. So the warbler built a new one. And I want to say it was like almost like a 6-7 tiered nest of just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So there might be hope that these things start to recognize what cowbirds are. So things that haven't done so well with humans moving in: river otters, wood turtles, bobcats, spotted salamanders. These are things that need large, untouched areas to move, to complete their life cycles, to hunt. And when we fragment these areas and eliminate the space that they need, they will obviously not do as well as they would have before us. Wood turtles are also susceptible to the pet trade. They're very easy to walk up and pick up a turtle and go and sell it. So we've lost a lot of wood turtles just due to the pet trade. Scarlet tanagers, Canada warblers, blue-headed vireos, black-throated blues. These are all things that like big untouched tract of woods. They also like some of them to nest in shrubbier habitats. We'll talk about that a little bit later, why we might be losing some of that high stem density shrub type habitat. Deer. I just can't wait to get to this section. Again, this is totally an opinionated thing I'm about to say, but deer, in my opinion, have become the largest threat to forest health and regeneration in New York. Again, that's just an opinion. Besides humans, deer have the biggest impact on our state forests. There's so many of them. Their exploding populations have just resulted in forests that don't really have any kind of seedling understory. Their eating habits also pave the way for invasive species, and as a result, a reduction in plant and wildlife diversity. So we have quite a contrasting photo. On the right, you can see there's a lot of plants and shrubs. On the left, it kind of looks like a field. On the right, the low-lying shrubs, you'll see there's a fence right down the middle of that picture. That's a deer exclosure on the right. It's excluding the deer. The deer can't get in there. On the left, the deer can get in there. And as you can see, they have eaten what was now growing in the exclosure. Just kind of highlights the impact of what deer can do. You'll also see a little math equation over there. I keep it easy with zeros and ones. But for every canopy tree in the woods, a canopy tree is one that reaches at least 80, 100 feet tall, is up in the canopy, soaking up the sunlight. There should be 10 smaller understory trees underneath it. So not quite at the canopy, but just a little bit below. For every 10 of those, there should be 100 trees in the deer zone. Deer zone is typically ground level to 6 feet, somewhere a deer can munch, where it can eat. That's the deer zone. And so we have one canopy tree, and then below it, 10 small understory trees, 100 trees in the deer zone. And in roughly every acre, you should have about 10 canopy trees per acre. So then you can just multiply the rest. Keep that in mind. Because we're going to head to Letchworth State Park, where I'm working right now. There's what we call the deer yarding area, which is about a 2,000 acre plot of the park that's in the south end of the park near the Glen Iris, where all the hustle and bustle is. That yarding area traditionally, though this has just changed, traditionally was off limits to hunting. All of a sudden, hunting season rolls around, and guess what? Deer aren't so stupid. They know where all the hunters are, so they all go to the 2,000 acre yarding area. In that area, we should expect 20,000 canopy trees if you're using 10 canopy trees per acre. And then obviously 200,000 understory trees and 2 million deer zone trees. You should be able to see in that 2,000 acres in Letchworth. But you can go walk it, I have. You will not find a single deer zone tree in that 2,000 acres, minus the things planted around like the Glen Iris and the buildings, shrubs. Why is that? Because of all the deer. Again, hunting season rolls around, boom, all the deer go right to that 2,000 acres, and then they just sit there all hunting season long and eat. But because of this, we have actually opened a very limited archery only opportunity to hunt in that section of the park, just to try and push them out a little bit. In a healthy forest, you should really ideally only be able to see about 10 feet in front of you. I had the chance to explore the Smoky Mountains for a little bit, and that was a big untouched tract of land, and it was just like that. I could see like 10 feet in front of me, and it was just thick, and there's native plants and flowers and all this great stuff because they don't have a huge deer population. So if you're looking at carrying capacity numbers, you should roughly have 20 deer per square mile. If you prefer to use acres instead of square miles, 1 square mile is roughly 640 acres. So high deer numbers, they're going to deplete forest resources, increase the risk of large die-offs during the winter months when food is scarce, and there'll be some other wildlife effects that I'll mention in a bit too. So keeping in mind the carrying capacity numbers, also consider that a deer can eat roughly 5 pounds of food per day. So using all those numbers, you can figure out that about 32 acres is needed for one deer to sustain itself. 32 acres, one deer. If you take your carrying capacity and multiply 20 deer per 640 acres, that's about 100 pounds of food per day. That's a lot of browsing from deer. So that's the sustainable number of browse consumption in a 600-acre forest. I used to work at Environmental State Park. It's roughly about that size. It's a little over 700 acres. There was way more than 20 deer in that park. I did a winter survey in the park of deer numbers with some of our biology crew. We found like roughly 200 deer were utilizing the park throughout the winter. 200. And so you can see how many pounds of food per day those deer were eating. As a result, the park is virtually no understory. And we had one severe winter where we had about 50 deer die of starvation. Every morning I would drive into the park and there was a dead deer on the road, on the parkway. And we weren't sure what was exactly going on. We could rule out that it wasn't just somebody running around hitting things with cars. 50 deer in like the span of a month is quite a bit. So we would get all the deer, and I had the wonderful job of having to take a saw and saw the legs of these dead deer. Quite a gruesome image, I know. But the reason we're doing that is we wanted to look at the bone marrow. We wanted to make sure there wasn't disease. We wanted to see what was going on. The bone marrow in the bones was gone. There was like no bone marrow because they were digesting themselves. They were so hungry. They didn't have food. So thankfully we ruled out there was no catastrophic disease. What was just happening was there was way too many deer and they were starving to death. So now Evansville State Park also has a archery-only hunting season to try and balance that back out. We were also getting a lot of complaints from local landowners whose houses bordered the park because the deer would hide in the park. Then at night they would go wander into these people's houses, or not into their houses, into their yards, and they would eat their gardens and their plants, and they were hitting them with their cars, and they knew that the problem was the deer were going to the park. So we used all that information to propose to the DEC that, hey, we need a hunting season at Evansville State Park. So if you look at this graph, it's quite simple. You can see as deer density per square mile increases, the number of songbirds you observe decreases. I had mentioned that many songbirds like to use shrubs to nest in. When you eliminate the complexity of the forest, all these different tiers and levels and heights of plants, the number of birds that can actually utilize the resources in that woods just decreases pretty dramatically. So more deer, less birds, especially songbirds. Same can be said for wildflower species. The more deer you have, the less native wildflowers you will see. On the one picture, the pink one on the right is a pink lady slipper. It's a type of orchid, and deer love them. They're like candy. So you don't really see pink lady slippers in big numbers throughout the state like you used to. There's little pockets still around, but it's very hard to find it. Same thing with like trilliums. Trilliums are hard to find when deer are around. They eat them all. And it can take a single trillium over 6 years to actually produce a flower. So it's got a slow life cycle. When a deer keeps eating it, that's going to affect its life cycle. I don't hate deer. They're just doing a lot of impact. I usually get that question at the end, like, wow, you really hate deer. I don't hate them, but they're doing some damage. So I have just briefly touched upon invasive non-native plants. I'm sure most people in here have a decent knowledge of invasives, but they have a broad climatic tolerance. They can handle different kind of climates. They often have lightweight seeds that are easily dispersed, and they produce a lot of them. And they often reach maturity in a very short time. Those are three really, if you look at the plant itself and don't get mad at it for taking over, it's actually a brilliant strategy for survival. They can just take over and survive any area that they're put in, which is pretty remarkable. They form dense stands, they move into disturbed sites, and they compete with native species. On the right is a little white butterfly that many people might be thinking, oh, I've seen that butterfly all over the place. It resembles the non-native cabbage white butterfly, which is what most people would see. But this is actually a native white butterfly called the West Virginia white butterfly. It used to be one of the most abundant butterflies in the state. I'm lucky if I see like half a dozen a year right now. And their host plant, their caterpillar host plant, the only plant the caterpillar can eat are toothworts. We have two species in Western New York, a cutleaf and a broadleaf. They tend to prefer the broadleaf toothwort. And that's the only thing their caterpillar can eat. Well, one problem is deer like to eat toothwort. The other problem is the plant that is paired with that picture. It is garlic mustard. Garlic mustard was brought in as a food source. We brought it over from Europe. It was totally taken over and really dense stands. And for some reason, the West Virginia white butterfly can't really tell the difference between garlic mustard and toothwort. And it almost seems to just prefer laying its eggs on garlic mustard. The problem is the caterpillars hatch and they can't eat garlic mustard. So the caterpillars don't survive. So the population of West Virginia white butterflies has just plummeted because of garlic mustard. We used to try and remove garlic mustard. I actually used to be a coordinator of the garlic mustard challenge for a preserve. And we'd have people come out and pick hundreds of pounds of it and try and get rid of it. The seeds can be dormant in the soil for like 10 years. So even though you might think you succeeded, you come back a couple of years and it's all back. In the early stages of this, people were realizing that when they picked a plant, they were picking it when the seed pods were out. The seed pods would open and they were just spreading the seeds everywhere. So people with good intentions actually kind of harmed some stuff early on. But now the current thought that biologists have found is that eventually garlic mustard kind of just checks itself somehow. I don't quite understand how. I haven't looked into it too much, but they're finding that stands left alone take over for a few years and then slowly start to shrink. Again, I don't know why. No matter what, it's had an impact on the West Virginia white butterfly. So you might be driving down the road and you look off into there and you say, well, I don't know what that guy was talking about. That looks pretty good to me. There's different age classes. It's nice and thick. I can't see 10 feet in front of me. That guy's crazy. This looks fine. Then you get out of your car and you take a closer look and you realize that all of these are actually non-native things. This is a real photograph. These are really identified, and they are all those non-native plants. Non-native plants aren't utilized by native insects. The deer typically don't really eat them. They prefer to go find our native stuff. And many of our songbirds don't utilize the fruits that they produce. They don't really nest in them. So what looks like an awesome green oasis really is a dead zone, not utilized by what was here before. So, in summary, with our deer, prevent healthy forest regeneration, alter species compositions, they reduce plant and wildlife diversity, and they pave the way for an increased number of invasives. If we took drastic measures right now, today, to curb and eliminate our deer to a sustainable number, it would still take centuries for our forests to recover. And the reason why I say that is trees don't grow very fast. Trees don't move very fast. And if you want to have that complex forest ecosystem with different age classes and different stands, it'll take centuries for that to happen because trees just grow really slow. Oaks, it wasn't unheard of for oaks to reach 800 years old in the state. Now we see an oak that's 300 and we're blown away with how old it is. But really for an oak, that's still pretty young. It's not out of the question for them to get really old. So again, it would take quite some time for this to actually recover. Which sounds depressing, I know, but there are things we can do. Sometimes I give this talk to like landowners, so some of that's kind of mixed in here, but you can do this stuff in your own yard. It does not matter how big your yard is. Things like planting evergreens, shrub cover, stuff that will provide bedding, nesting areas, food. Again, if you're going to do this, make sure what you're planting is native to the area. You don't want to just start spreading more non-native things around. So, enter the pollinator garden. I'm sure someone in here is familiar with Doug Tolmie. He had the idea, well, has the idea, of if people just took a tiny section of the yard, don't have to commit your whole yard, and planted native things. Every single house in every suburb, every city did this. All of a sudden, you would have this big connected habitat that would equate to larger than all of our national parks put together. He has a fancy name for it. I never write it down, so I never remember it, but it might be something like Homegrown National Park, something like that, which is kind of a cool idea. And again, all it takes is planting some native flowers. We all plant flowers in our yards. Why not plant some native things? I have tons of pollinator gardens that I've started, and what I like about them is they are way less maintenance after 2-3 years than an annual garden. Because once these plants take off, you don't have to do a thing. They're from here. They evolved here. They prefer to be left alone. All these plants are native. The one that is yellow is ragwort. It blooms the first, early in the spring. The next one to bloom would be the red one, scarlet bee balm. Hummingbirds love it. That blooms in the summer. And then late summer into the fall, that purple one is New England aster. So your garden will have color continuously year-round, which is different from the annual plants we buy from a nursery because they all peak at the same time and then boom, by the end of summer, it looks horrible. Plant some different native wildflowers in your garden. They have staggered bloom times because they evolved with our pollinators, and our pollinators need some kind of food source as long as it's warm out. So these have all kind of have their own little niche time of the year that they bloom for things to utilize. And again, they're all perennial. They will come back every year. You don't have to do anything. I found that it takes me about 2 years to weed out stuff I don't want. And then after that, the garden takes care of itself, which is awesome. So yeah, that takes care of that slide. If you have the chance and you can add some wetlands, that's also a great thing. Everything needs water. We need water. So anytime you get a chance to add some water into a landscape design, it can be just a small little pond, a fountain in your yard, something birds can drink out of. Water is always going to attract wildlife. Again, different kinds of native plants that will produce beneficial food. I won't read every one word for word. The good news is there are locally people who have started nurseries that only sell native plants. And many of our big nurseries are also starting to have sections in their garden centers that have native options, which is awesome. It's been actually a pretty quick turnaround within the past 5-10 years that has happened. So you can get these things. Personally, I find it just as easy to go out in the woods this time of year and go collect seeds from the native plants, making sure you leave enough to regenerate what was there. Take like 1/3 of the seeds that you want, throw them outside in a pot in the winter. They do their winter stratification on their own. Then in the spring, boom, you got free native plants. It's pretty easy to do. So, change in species compositions due to climate change. Everyone has an opinion on climate change. All I'm saying is there's a change, it's happening. Here's what is predicted, what our forests might look like. Many of our northern hardwood species, the ones on the left, we will see less of. And many of the southern hardwood species that are already in the state are actually going to do better because our climate is predicted to shift and be more like Carolinas, something like that. So northern hardwoods are going to keep moving up. Southern hardwoods are going to keep moving up. We'll look something more like Carolinas whenever that happens. All the animals on the screen there are traditionally southern living species that have moved up. Red-bellied woodpeckers. Most people can at least recognize they've seen one of those. They're pretty common. But if you look at old bird lists, old Christmas bird counts, like 100 years ago or less, they weren't that common. They weren't being seen. They were a southern species. They've moved north. Now they're a regular part of our landscape. Black vultures, different from the turkey vultures we're familiar with. Southern species, moving up. They live in the Niagara Gorge. Sometimes they hang out there year-round. The butterfly is a giant swallowtail butterfly. Southern butterfly, it's now found up here in the north. Sassafras, that's what the leaves are. Southern tree, it's doing pretty well in New York. And Kentucky warblers are starting to nest farther and farther north every year. I wouldn't be surprised within 50 years or maybe less, I don't know. It wouldn't be unreasonable to find Kentucky warblers nesting at the Pennsylvania line into the bottom half of New York. Maybe even here, I don't know. So updates from the field. Lots of words there. Most people are familiar that the American chestnut is gone due to the chestnut blight, more or less gone, and that a hybrid has been created. I was actually just 2 weeks ago talking to one of the lead people on the hybrid research panel. I don't remember what his exact title was. He thinks we're really close to actually being able to sell the hybrid species commercially. You can get your hands on them, but they're not being sold widespread. But he's hopeful that that will change soon. They've basically taken 1/16 of Chinese chestnut DNA and plopped it into the American chestnut. That 1/16 is what is the resistant strain or resistant gene for the tree to survive chestnut blight. So they've made a resistant hybrid. I don't think it's any surprise to anybody that our ash trees are like virtually gone. Emerald ash borer has virtually wiped out most of the species. Many people aren't familiar with the fact that we actually have multiple species of ash. We have green, we have white, we have black, we have pumpkin. There's all these kinds of ash. All of them have been hit hard by emerald ash borer. Where the emerald ash borer is native to, it's an Asian species. There is a ash over there called Manchurian ash. Because that tree has evolved with the emerald ash borer, it recognizes when the larvae is feeding on it, and it produces defensive compounds that make the tree not tasty. Basically, the emerald ash borer stops eating it. So what they're doing is trying to take that gene from the Manchurian ash and put it into our species. What has been a hindrance is that ours, despite all being called ash trees, they aren't terribly closely related. So it's been very hard to incorporate that DNA into ours, except for black ash, which is a wetland species. So it might not do too good in your yard. But they've been able to make a hybrid. And I think, what are they calling it? Northern treasure ash, a hybrid that might work. But again, black is it's a wetland species. So it's not one of those big, beautiful ash trees that you had in your backyard. But maybe it'll work. They've also released 3 hymenopterans, little insects that are going to be used as a biological control. That's always touch and go. You take a non-native insect and then you say, well, I'm going to take its predator from over east and I'm going to bring its predator here, and the predator will control the ash borer. And in theory, it only eats the ash borer. So when it's done doing its job, it's going to starve and die, and we'll be back in harmony. I'm not a biologist. I have no idea. But in my mind, the hymenopterans are just going to say, well, you know what? I'm pretty hungry. This thing's close enough. I'm just going to eat this. And then we'll have another problem. But I don't know. I didn't do the studies. They do make sure these things are okay, but oftentimes we sometimes make a mess when we try and have a solution. But time will tell. Eastern hemlock, same thing. We have hemlock woolly adelgid. Letchworth State Park being plagued by that right now. You can do a chemical injection to help treat the trees. Unlike an ash, which you have to treat like every 2 years, it can be $400 a tree. That gets very expensive. The hemlock seem to take the defensive chemical and kind of incorporate it into their own defensive chemicals. And you can treat them as once every 10 years. Sometimes just one treatment seems to be okay. So they seem to be better off with the treatment. There's also biological controls. Big Latin name there. You can just call him Larry. Larry is a biological control being used. And then there's a new one. I've never been good at pronouncing that, and I'm not going to try. But you can see big word up there with an S. So these are biological controls that are supposed to eat the adelgids and then die from starvation, but time will tell. Maybe Larry will stick around for a bit longer. Then the new one, spotted lanternfly, may have heard about this one. It is an invasive pest from Asia. Originally thought it was only feeding on tree of heaven, which is great. Tree of heaven's non-native. We can just get rid of both. But it turns out there's actually like over 70 host species that the spotted lanternfly will use, one of which is grapes. If the spotted lanternfly actually, it's already in New York, but it's not in big numbers yet. But if it expands even more than it has, this could be pretty devastating for the wine industries of like the Finger Lakes, the Southern Tier, because these things target orchards, vineyards. They like grapes. Some were spotted in Buffalo. We had one in Letchworth State Park. It was smushed. It was dead, but it was on the underside of someone's camper. These are how these things spread. Pennsylvania is just loaded with these things. Someone was at the Nature Center showing me videos of trees, hundreds of spotted lanternflies on the trees. It's probably only a matter of time, but keep your eyes open for that bug on the very top. It looks awesome. It's really colorful and it looks pretty cool. But if you see that, smush it and then report it to the DEC, because that is going to be a nasty one to deal with. Oh, I did this in pretty good timing. So what's to come? While we can't predict every change that's going to occur, we can expect to see shifts in things like tree dominance, species abundance, change in the makeup of our forests. But remember back, we were a tundra at one time. Change is going to happen no matter what. The worrying we have is that the rate of change right now is pretty dramatic. It's happening really fast at a rate that many species just can't cope with or keep up with. Change is going to happen, but we have to mitigate how fast that is happening. So all of us, with good stewardship, conservation practices, we can have an impact. Think of the homegrown national park. Little things we can all do can have a positive impact, and we can try and ensure that what we're doing, our actions, actually leave a positive benefit for the people who come after us. Because as we all know, that is what it's all about. Leaving it better off than what we were given. So I think with that, we can then open it up to some questions if anyone has any.